So what you're describing with this musicianship that David Kuiken is doing, that now we're back to this idea of language and predicting how the syntax of a language works, and that always reminds me that I've had in the past in some of the churches where I was working, I would have some people come to me after service, and then you play some Bach piece as a postlude or something like that, and they would say that with Bach I know what is coming. Which is funny because on one hand there's the thing that yes, that of course it had to go there or it must have gone there, but it's a totally different thing to recognize that it makes sense that it went there, that there is this predictability on one hand, but actually coming up with it on your own is a whole different story, because otherwise everybody could be writing like Bach, and that is not the case. And what you also said about the fact that nowadays everything is analytical, and I keep thinking about that historically, that with the introduction of the conservatoire system, with the Paris Conservatoire, and the division of the learning process into clearly organized, which is of course a very enlightened idea and very much in the sense of the French Revolution, that like now you have a subject for oral skills and there you listen to jumps here and there. But before that, if we look at Bach, I mean, Bach didn't have a formal training in a conservatoire like that. And of course, he had definitely spent time learning counterpoint and, learning separate things. But they always would be tied in with practical purpose. And it would, I think, otherwise it is unimaginable that at a very young age already, people back then would have a proficiency in the musical language, which was so complete, which I think is impossible if you don't, from the very beginning, try to learn it, as you said, as a language, as a mother tongue in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right that you have to learn at a very young age. I also think you're right that the development of the conservatoire in Europe changed the way we teach music. But I think it's important to realize that in music training that reading notes is a completely different skill than playing an instrument or singing. And we kind of forget that because all of us are literate. There was a time that people spoke German or English without being able to read or write.
Yeah.
And we can't imagine that anymore. And we don't even imagine the impact it has had on our own oral mastery of the language.
Right.
But reading is a different skill. And unfortunately, in music training, we haven't thought a lot about that. Someone who did think a lot about that, of course, was Zoltán Kodály. And the Kodály method is actually a reading method. He's teaching students how to read notes. And but of course, before you learn to read any language, you have to speak the language. We forget that at high school when people try to teach people how to learn French, and particularly if you're learning something like Hebrew, the first thing they teach you is the alphabet. Not speaking the language, but teaching you the alphabet. So we've lost the idea that you have to learn to speak the language first and then learn how to read and write. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, that improvisation as a musical skill just disappeared after the conservatoire arrived, because probably improvisation was seen as something very difficult to teach. And because, of course, in the practical situation in concerts, it became less and less important. I think it kind of died out for some reason in what we call classical music.
Right.
And so there are all sorts of influences that have...
But why did it die out? Do you have any idea? I mean, what came first, the conservatoire or the dying out?
I'm not sure that the conservatoire can be blamed for the dying out of improvisation. I think it's an aesthetic thing, that the whole concept of what music is, changed towards the end of the 19th century. And still that's a major debate, of course, in what direction should music go. It's always interesting to look at history and see what composers began doing. For example, in the 20th century, you have so many different solutions to the problem of what should I write. But what they didn't do was, of course, what the jazz musicians did was to go into improvisation. So the whole idea of improvisation was taken over by world music and jazz, and I think that's unfortunate, and maybe that will change. I don't know.
Because you mentioned literacy, and I'm thinking now also about musical literacy, not only among trained musicians, so the performers, but also for the public. And I'm wondering sometimes that, as we said before, that the way we perform music nowadays as a sort of ultra-polished performance, which is sort of like that's the way it should be, there's beauty in it, but very often it seems that a lot of the appreciation of that music comes from a purely aesthetical point of view. Now, I'm not saying that beauty doesn't matter, because I like Roger Scruton, so I'm definitely in favor of beauty, but beauty for beauty's sake in itself is pointless. But if you grow up in a world, as you said, that people learn to speak before they learn to write, and as such, if improvised music and music as a language, really in that syntax, was everywhere, was all around, if it was the normal modus operandi, then it certainly probably would have affected also the listening habits of the public, which anyway might have been a more limited public back then, so a certain elite and the aristocracy or whatever. But if they're surrounded by this kind of music making, it might be that they were also more open for that. And then you get a different level of communication, because then actually music is really telling a story to that person, which goes beyond the idea of beauty.
Yeah. I remember a story. Maria Callas spoke Italian, of course, and she lived in Italy and performed at La Scala. And I remember in the big fight that she was having with Renata Tebaldi at that point, she would sometimes on the stage while she was performing an opera, if a particular sentence kind of fitted her relationship with her antagonistic audience, she would turn to the audience and speak sing the sentence to the audience, you know. And I think you're right that the contact with the audience is affected by the way we perform classical music. And so I think our idea of aesthetics has to be reviewed. I think music is about communication. And of course, the discussion of aesthetics, frequently we look down at pop music. But of course, what pop musicians are doing is exactly what we should be doing. They are communicating to their audience, and everybody in our society, you can see that happening. You can see how these people react to these performers, and because that kind of disgusts us, this kind of relationship between the pop artist and these waving audience members, we have kind of reduced the amount of communication that we have in performance to almost null. And of course that has a lot to do with the way we are performing. It has a lot to do with the fact that we are not actually communicating in the musical language. We're just repeating something that everyone knows and of course recognizes, expects. Now they know this is coming. Now they know that, and they enjoy that. But we're not surprising them in any way, and not speaking to their particular situation, if I can call it something like that.